Okay, let's go ahead and do the opening prayers that we've been doing. The praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, that's on page 73. Let's do this 3 times in English. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I for refuge. 88. If you have the later prayer book for the short mandala offering prayer, and I think I've been saying 88, it's actually 87 is the short mandala offering, and then the refuge prayer is 88 in the old prayer book. Those are some folks online who are using that one. We'll do the short mandala offering prayer, the offering mantra that's on page 98, and then we'll continue with refuge and bodhicitta, once in English, twice in the Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Radna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyab Suchi Daki Chunyangi Peso Namgi Drola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shog Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyab Suchi Daki Chunyangi Pesanamgi Drola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shog. You can set the prayer books aside and we'll do a short meditation before we begin the class. Find a good meditation posture, making sure the back is somewhat straight, upright, and then releasing into this posture as best as you can, letting go of any tension. And breathing naturally, begin to attend to the breath. And if you have a technique you already use with the breath, then feel free to use that for the next few minutes. And if not, then as usual, I suggest working with this point at the tip of the nose where we feel the sensation of the air coming in and out of the nostrils. And whatever way we're working with the breath, we have this factor of introspection that checks in occasionally to see what the quality of our meditation is, to see if we're still together with the object of meditation. And if we've wandered away at that time, if we've gotten caught up in thoughts, planning, remembering, whatever the case might be, or maybe even other sensations, hearing noises from the street or what have you, Whenever we see that that's happened, that we've gotten distracted and left the breath, then the goal at that time is to let go of whatever it was that distracted you and gently return to the breath. So I'll ring the chime and we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes. And then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set the best motivation for being here tonight. So now let's set our motivation for tonight. And I thought that perhaps it would be useful to do a brief review of the Four Noble Truths. This is the chapter that we are looking at currently in Nagarjuna's text, an examination of the Four Noble Truths. And it's important that we understand them conventionally, though, as we're seeing in this chapter, they are empty of inherent existence. They don't exist at that level. Nonetheless, they do exist conventionally. And it's important that we embrace that conventional understanding. And first of all, there is the truth of dukkha, this unsatisfactory state that we find ourselves in. And as you think about each of these, think about them initially for yourself, really understanding that this is your predicament, your situation. But without a doubt, this is also the predicament that all beings in samsara find themselves in. It's having to experience pain, the more manifest forms of suffering, but also having to experience this dukkha of change, that even what we find that is pleasant, that produces some measure of happiness in our lives, is transitory, very fleeting, doesn't lead to real pleasure. And then the deepest level of our dukkha, that we are in this conditioned existence, going from life to life, under the control of factors that keep us bound in this state. In this way, we are always in this state of dissatisfaction. As long as this is the case, as long as we're under the control of the causes of that dukkha, which is the second noble truth, that the causes of our situation are within ourselves, our own karma that we've created, as well as the delusions, especially the root of ignorance that we're trying to undermine in this text by studying the topic of emptiness. So just briefly reflect on those two truths, how this is your situation, but moreover, this is a situation that all beings in samsara find themselves in, experiencing dukkha because they have the causes of that within their own mental continuum. And then in the last two truths, the Buddha spoke first of the end of dukkha, the cessation of this unsatisfactory state, that it can come to an end, and all the causes of it can come to an end. And this is attained through the fourth noble truth, the true path that leads to that cessation. And this is what we are studying here as well, on the basis of having a good foundation of morality, to develop deep concentration, and then to apply that concentration to the cultivation of wisdom, especially the wisdom realizing emptiness that will completely annihilate the ignorance that is at the root of all of our unsatisfactory experience, the root of samsara. And if we do that, we can attain nirvana, we can attain true peace. We can know an end to all this dissatisfaction, all the causes of it. So think here about how this is possible for both you and all beings to attain, and not just your own solitary peace, but the non-abiding nirvana that is Buddhahood, the state where we can be free of our own suffering, but be abiding in the world in ways to help others to alleviate their suffering. So again, apply that to yourself and then to all beings. And then as you set your motivation of bodhicitta, let those thoughts about the Four Noble Truths feed into it in terms of understanding that although this is our predicament that we find ourselves in now, and that all beings in samsara are in, there is that possibility and that potential for each of us to attain full enlightenment. So therefore, we dedicate ourselves to accomplishing that goal, to becoming a Buddha as quickly as possible so we can then help all beings to attain that same state. Within this understanding of the Four Noble Truths, we see that this is not some pipe dream, but this is a true motivation that we can actualize our own enlightenment and therefore then the enlightenment of all beings that will ensue. And hold that motivation for being here tonight. Okay, so again, we're working with the 3 chapters of Nagarjuna's Fundamental Wisdom. I think we may, in the back, might need a copy of the text. Does everyone else has a copy of the text, perhaps? You don't have, might have to make another copy then. We're not going to do so many verses tonight, I think. But anyway, this is the other handout that I don't know if people got this last week. A few people may not have gotten it if you weren't here last week. Stephen, would you mind doing those as well? This is the handout that I've been going through on the two truths. We talked about the Four Noble Truths as part of our motivation tonight, but the two truths is also a very important teaching, and it plays a big role in terms of chapter 24. So once more, in these three chapters, what we've looked at so far is chapter 26, which explains the 12 links of dependent origination and how we are propelled through the force of our ignorance to continue to create these causes for our circling in samsara, and how this can all be, of course, undone if we have the wisdom realizing emptiness. Then we went on to cultivate that wisdom realizing emptiness through the teachings of chapter 18. Chapter 18 is on the person, the self that we cling to so tightly, and looking at an investigation of that. So we kind of saw the reality of emptiness presented in that chapter, though again, Nagarjuna presents emptiness in all the other chapters that precede the one that we're looking at currently, which is chapter 24. In chapter 24, he brings those two ideas together, the conventional reality of our samsaric experience with the ultimate truth of emptiness that we discerned in chapter 18, and is talking about, because remember this chapter started, if we go to chapter 24, the first few verses, we see that it started with these objections being raised. Somebody comes forward and says, well, if what you're saying is true, well then the Four Noble Truths don't exist. And if the Four Noble Truths don't exist, then all these various other things don't exist, all the way to the three jewels and what have you. It basically would mean that all of Buddhism would be undermined within an understanding of emptiness that this particular opponent is holding. In verse 24:7, where Nagarjuna replies to this, these first 6 verses that are essentially, somebody saying that you've undermined all of conventional existence by what you said. Let's read verse 7 together right now. You who speak in these terms have failed to understand the purpose of emptiness, emptiness itself, and the meaning of emptiness. You are therefore harmed by it. So we won't go through all of that again, but we went through that last week, how Nagarjuna is first saying, you don't understand what emptiness really is, the purpose of realizing it, the real meaning of it, nature of it. So you don't have any grounds to stand on because you're speaking from a place of ignorance rather than a place of wisdom. And so this was his initial refutation, but then of course he decides that he needs to go on to talk about the fact that this person obviously mustn't understand the two truths, how we can have conventional truth that is upheld within the space of ultimate truth, emptiness, that these two become complementary and not contradictory. The initial verses, the person was saying, well, if there's ultimate truth, emptiness, well, then there can't be anything else. It's going to refute everything else, because in their mind, inherent or intrinsic existence is equivalent to mere existence. So when you negate the one, then you negate everything. There is nothing that exists in the space of that. So let's read verse 24:8. This is the verse that introduces the two truths. The Buddha's teaching of the Dharma is based entirely on the two truths, the truth of worldly convention and the ultimate truth. So we began our little discussion of these, and we went through the initial kind of commentary on this verse. But keep in mind that Lama Tsongkhapa, in the text that we're kind of referring to as our commentary as we go through this ocean of reasoning, he takes this opportunity to go into an entire kind of side topic of the two truths and how they are set out. And so before we got in too deeply into that, I decided it would be useful to review the handout that you just got, and I think all those online should have it as well, that I gave out last week, which actually comes from something I prepared when we did the studies of the middle length Lam Rim, which most of you know, I mentioned this last week, when Geshe Sherab returns in May, he's going to get back into that text and review the calm abiding section, which I think he only has a little bit left to do, and then go into the special insight section, which is what this came from, was from the discussion of special insight in Lama Tsongkhapa's middle length Lam Rim. These were some passages, and I said here that this came from the two truths, and there's another book, though, that by Guy Newland that I'm referring to for all of our explanations, Appearance and Reality. But The Two Truths is an excellent book. The Appearance and Reality is going to be a much shorter explanation if you do decide to, pursue some additional reading on this topic. But The Two Truths has got everything covered in it. I mean, it talks about even, you know, the how an omniscient mind of a Buddha knows the two truths and all these kinds of things that I'm sure all of you are staying up late, you know, not being able to get to sleep because this really troubles you. You know, how does a Buddha know the two truths? Anyway, but we're going to go into a little bit more of an explanation of this. And after the last talk, Bob brought up to me a few points that could be misconstrued that I want to make sure we clarify, because although, you know, everything I said last week is perfectly fine, you might misinterpret what I said. And it is possible to misinterpret some of these things. And so we'll look at those as we go through this. So the handout that you have, it has the initial 6 points that Guy Newland in his book uses to discuss the two truths as they're presented in particularly Prasangika Madhyamaka, again, the consequence middle way school that we're studying. Let's go through these again real briefly. The very first one is the two truths are mutually exclusive. Mutually exclusive means there is nothing that is both, that it is either one or the other. They're a dichotomous division of everything that exists, objects of knowledge. And of course, you know, when we get into the next one, we see that, you know, kind of they're lined up together with each other. There is everything that we can posit as a conventional truth has its own ultimate truth, has its own emptiness. And this is how it always exists, is that you have something that can be posited as existing, and then you have the emptiness of that. I'm going to do one more thing, and then I will get to the question that was asked online just before we convene before we left off last week. But the second point that I want to make here from Guy Newlands is the two truths, although mutually exclusive, are a single entity. Because emptiness, ultimate truth, is the mode of subsistence of conventional phenomena, concealer truths or conventional truths. So what he's saying here, in essence, is that you have these two kind of realities, if you will. I mean, we don't want to talk about them as specifically levels of reality, because that might get into a different understanding. You have two things that you can analyze in regard to how things exist. The first is their conventional nature, which we don't do deep analysis on. We simply understand that something exists because we find an appropriate base for it, and then we designate it as that. And of course, this is how we come to understand conventional truths in terms of the deeper level. But these are generally posited, and we'll get into the etymology of all of this, by ignorance, by a mind that is together with ignorance. So everything in our world that has been established, from speaker to you know, picture to wall to fan to person to whatever, all the phenomena that are designated are generally designated, you know, by a mind that's together with ignorance. When we come to understand emptiness, we come to see that the things that we have posited in that way don't exist in the way that they appear. This is why I was telling you earlier, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but when we use the term conventional truth, we really aren't talking about a truth. Because truth essentially means, how do we define truth? Truth in this context is something that exists in the way that it appears. And all of these things that we've designated appear to exist from their own side, appear to have their own mode of subsistence, appear to establish themselves. And they don't exist that way at all. Because once more, through our analysis of emptiness and our finding of the ultimate truth, we come back around to understand conventional truths as falsities. But of course, everyone who's, you know, together with that ignorance thinks that everything that they've designated in the world exists in the way that it appears. So they are truths only in the perspective of an ignorant mind, a mind that's together with ignorance, that is concealing or obscuring ultimate truth to them. So within this context, we talked about a couple of points that I did want to bring up and delineate some discussion on, you know, through discussion, some fine points on this. One of them had to do with this idea of when we talk about emptiness being of one taste. Bob brought up that there could be a misunderstanding that we start making this, and we even have this in Tantra, right? Those of you who practice Tantra, you often see this idea that out of emptiness, you arise in the form of a deity, as if there is this phenomenon that is called emptiness in general that exists as kind of some reified substratum. Emptiness is a quality. Emptiness can be generalized. We can talk about the general characteristic of emptiness, because there are all phenomena that exist have that quality of emptiness. But when we talk about things in that way, we are not, even though there is one taste in the sense that every emptiness is an equal negation, as we talked about last week, Stephen brought this up, it's a non-affirming negation, a negation of inherent existence with regard to I, book, table, whatever it is, all the phenomena that exist. That emptiness is identical in that regard, but it is not the same emptiness. In terms of the emptiness of the book is not the emptiness of the person. Initially, they say that you realize the emptiness of the self, the person, before you go on to realize the emptiness of phenomena. Well, if you were realizing a single unitary emptiness, then you wouldn't need to go on to other phenomena, right? There would be no point because you've already understood it when you were examining it in regard to the person, the I. So emptiness is a characteristic of everything that exists. So while we do talk about, this is the second point, while we do talk about it as a general, kind of generalized or the general phenomenon, we can't really find something that is that. I use the example when I had some communications with Bob on this of impermanence too. We talk about impermanence, but impermanence really doesn't make sense unless you're talking about the phenomenon that is impermanent, that is changing moment by moment. There isn't this thing that is impermanence that exists out there that you can locate and say, oh, there's impermanence. And it would be the same with emptiness. I can find instances of emptiness, but I can't find the generality of emptiness. Nonetheless, the generality of emptiness does exist because the instances exist. Let me use a different example. I brought in with me the Debate in Tibetan Buddhism book, which talks about generalities and instances. And maybe this gets a little too technical, but nonetheless, I like the example that he uses. This is by Daniel Perdue. He says, for example, every man, woman, and child is an instance of the generality human, which pervades every human. Some non-Buddhists assert that this generality is a different entity from the instances of humans that it pervades. The Buddhists deny this, saying that the generality and its instances are not different entities. Even though it certainly seems as if there is some general person who is separate and apart from all of its various manifestations, the Buddhists say that when one investigates to find what this is, it cannot be found. Still, the two, a human who is an instance of human, and the human which is a generality, are mutually exclusive. They don't have, because we're talking about a generality versus the instances. There is no common locus of these two, but even so, they are not different entities. They are the same entity, because all the instances of human are men, women, and children, and the human generality is said by some non-Buddhists to be a different entity from its instances as a functioning. We're getting into more language here that I might need to explain. So what we're talking about whenever we use this idea of a generality, which is how we do talk about emptiness frequently, right? We say, oh, I'm going to meditate on emptiness. Well, you have to be meditating on the emptiness of a phenomenon to kind of get at it, because otherwise, what are you meditating on? The non-inherent existence, period. Well, non-inherent existence is a quality that things have. It's not something that is findable, locatable in that general sense. It's only locatable in terms of a book that is the basis for that emptiness, a person that is the basis for that emptiness. Okay, so it's just to make sure that we don't in some way, and I'll share a little bit of, I was really glad that Bob did the research. It saved me from having to pick through a lot of books. I thank you for doing that, Bob. One of the quotes from Guy Newland in The Two Truths, he says, thus in the Gelugpa reading of Prasangika Madhyamaka, the plurality of emptinesses is philosophically significant. If there were only one emptiness, then it would have to be its own mode of abiding, and thus it would be inherently existent, which sounds strange to say that emptiness would be inherently existent. Emptiness is often spoke of, even by Gelugpas, as though it were unitary, and indeed it is said that all things have one taste, that is, the taste of no inherent existence. On the other hand, the Gelugpa assertion of emptiness says, all of which are the final nature of something, and none of which is its own ultimate nature, helps maneuver the Gelugpas away from a reifying extreme. An emptiness, that is an ultimate truth, is an ontological ultimate, insofar as it is the final mode of being of some phenomenon, but it is not a self-instituting monistic ground. So it's not that we're ever going to get into a place where we reify emptiness. And this leads right into the question that was asked at the end of last week, which was the emptiness of emptiness. How do we kind of work with that concept? It's the fact that when we even look at emptiness, which is the non-inherent existence of, again, emptiness of book, emptiness of person, what have you, we find that it too cannot withstand ultimate analysis. If we go looking for that emptiness to be there in a independent, absolute way, we don't find it to exist that way. It is not ultimately findable. In the end, we find the emptiness of emptiness as well, because it too is relative. And I find it interesting, in Guy Newland's book, he even points to some early people and looking at Madhyamika that thought that that was how emptiness existed, as some sort of non-relative absolute phenomenon on its own, while it was a quality at the same time of all these things that are conventionally existent. It's kind of goes against the grain of what we're really talking about here. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So we find that there is nothing that, because when we're really getting down to these two truths, what we're talking about is whether we are engaged in conventional analysis or ultimate analysis. Conventional analysis is satisfied at just the mere appearance and how things are, and in that very conventional way that we refer to things. So we can establish chairs and tables, and is there someone in the room tonight? If you had somebody who you're looking for, you could easily identify that person. That's the conventional analysis. It's not really looking for the mode of existence of things. Ultimate analysis is seeing whether they are true in the way that I mentioned earlier. Do they exist in the way that they appear? And if we go in to analyze any phenomenon whatsoever, even emptiness itself, we do not find them to be their own mode of subsistence. We don't find them to exist from their own side. We don't find them to be able to establish themselves. That non-finding is their emptiness. So it's like when Venerable Rabin often uses the example of if you always throw your keys in a particular drawer or something, and you go there to get your keys, and you look in the drawer and you see the absence of keys, right? They're not there in the drawer. You pick around, you keep looking under things as if it's going to somehow magically appear, but that's a seeing of a non-existence of the keys in your drawer. It's the same when we arrive at that realization of emptiness. We see, I'm using see not in the visual sense, but in the sense of understanding, the non-existence of what we thought was there. We thought things existed from their own side, but when we do the analysis, we find the lack of that. We find an emptiness, a voidness, a lack of something. So it's a negative that we're realizing in that context. That negative will be found whatever phenomenon we analyze. That's why, again, we can say that they're all of one taste, because all of the emptinesses that exist are similar in terms of the non-finding of inherent existence, the lack of inherent existence. But they're all unique in terms of the base that they are posited with. As long as this book exists, the emptiness of book will exist. If I were to, decide to throw this in a fire and be consumed by flames, the emptiness of book would no longer exist because the book no longer exists. The emptiness of dawn will cease to exist when dawn ceases to exist. So emptiness is together always with a phenomenon. So I just thought it was useful that Bob brought these points up, because it is important that we don't fall into any of those misunderstandings, that suddenly we start reifying emptiness or think that, as I said, it is strange in the tantric teachings where they say, and then you arise out of emptiness. Well, you have to understand that you're looking at the emptiness of the I in that case. And in your tantric practice, you're dissembling this inherent existence that we're clinging to in regard to this I. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to just arise out of some sort of nebulous emptiness. So any questions or comments on that? Yeah, Mark.
The Diamond Sutra. There's a statement that if there's billions and billions of worlds, and you take every single grain of sand in every single world, it's completely empty.
Mm-hmm.
And they always add this second sentence, which is, and that's why we call them
The grains of
grains of sand.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. So Mark is bringing up from the Diamond Sutra the concept where you have all of these things being mentioned, and you were talking about, yeah, the grains of sand and these various world systems, whatever, that, and speaking to their emptiness. And then the second point they always make after establishing the emptiness of that is that therefore they are called grains of sand, or whatever, that, you know. And then there's that repetition with regard to a lot of different things that the Buddha analyzes in that sutra. And this is exactly it. And in a sense, it's almost speaking to the way in which we go about realizing things, because right now, our view of conventional truth, we're going to be talking about it now to loosen up our sense of the concreteness of all of that, but our view of conventional truth is together with ignorance. When we come to realize emptiness, ultimate truth, it's only then that we really recognize the subtle way that conventional truths exist, which is that they are only called that, they are only named that, they are only designated that, they're only conceived of as that, labeled as that, you know, and so on. So we use all these different terms to refer to that process, but that's the way in which phenomena are existing. There's nothing more than nominal existence. So therefore, anything we talk about is simply called that, is simply named that, is simply thought of as that. There's nothing from the side of the object that is that. It doesn't have its own mode of subsistence. It doesn't have its own way of establishing itself. Everything is merely designated through an imputing consciousness. And imputing consciousnesses can be any consciousness. Obviously, you know, an ant is having an imputation of its world and how it is experiencing the counter that's crawling on and the sugar that it's rating and whatever the case might be, you know. But we've, in our culture, of course, we use language to refer to a lot of things, but we're not, and I like Guy Newland also spends a bit of time talking about how we can't fall into that trap either and think we're only talking about a linguistic designation of things. It's not language, that merely language, as some Western philosophers have held. It's a whole thought process. It's how we structure our world, and we think of things in certain terms. And then those terms define how we then hold on to those phenomena as if they had that existence from their own side. And we establish phenomena together with that ignorance then. But in the end, they're just called that. And the calling of things is not a problem. I mean, we need conventionalities. Obviously, I couldn't be sitting here talking to you if we didn't have ways to refer to things in our world, and ideas and thoughts and ways of structuring our experience. This is all, you know, part of being in the world, is to have a way of structuring the world. The problem gets to be that we think the world is structured that way from its own side, that it's somehow already organized that way. We're just kind of finding out what it is. Oh, the chair was always a chair. It was always established as a chair, self-established as a chair. We just learn the name for it and then we can refer to it, but it's got its own identity out there on that base. But it doesn't have that at all. Things are simply called that, simply designated that. So most people don't, again, entertain these ideas. This is the problem. Everyone's under the control of this ignorance, and people just take for granted that the world that appears to them exists in the way that it appears. And they keep buying into that ignorance, strengthening that ignorance, and get, you know, go from life to life, propelled by that ignorance and all the things that follow from it, all the other delusions, all the actions, the karma that follow from that. And they simply create their own suffering. But if we introduce the topic of emptiness, then people begin to investigate and see, well, does reality exist in the way that it appears? Yeah. That's why I often use the example of a dream, because in a dream, this is where we buy in so much to the way that things appear to us. And we have great emotions in our dreams. I think I used this last week as an example. You can come out of your dream really excited and almost, desirous with attachment, or you can come out of your dream frightened to death, or you can come out of your dream angry at the world around you or something. You can buy into dream reality in a way that is totally contradictory to how it actually exists. It appears to be real to your dream mind, but it doesn't have that existence at all. Well, this is why we're all in a dream, in a sense. We're all buying into reality as if it were as real as it appears, and it doesn't exist that way at all. So the Buddha's teachings, such as in the Diamond Sutra and so on, are to help us to come to understand their lack of inherent existence, and thereby we can simply establish things as nominally existent, simply establish them as merely imputed, merely designated. Nothing more than that. Anything more than that is to be refuted because it doesn't exist. So, sorry I went off on that. I kind of maybe spent too much time on it, but Did that help somewhat to kind of understand the way those passages are?
Well,
I love your laugh, Mark.
help, I'm not sure that's the right word. Push to be,
Yeah.
another step into
Okay.
Buddhist.
Well, and that's, yeah, I always give that sort of advice when I'm teaching on emptiness. It's just me teaching on emptiness, and I don't have any great realizations of emptiness at all, so it's just from my study and intellectual understanding to some degree from the studies I've done, but, no great realizations at all. So really, it's important to be with teachers who do have realizations, to go get teachings from emptiness if you can, from His Holiness. His Holiness isn't doing quite so much travel these days, so you have to go to India pretty much to see him, but and from Lama Zopa, there'll be an opportunity later this year. They're actually going to open up the registration for Light of the Path, big retreat, the 4-week retreat with Rinpoche in North Carolina in August and September. Mm.
It's like a crack or a crevasse or something. And so it just keeps getting wider.
Right, good. Until it eventually splits open. Mark was saying it's like a crack or a crevasse that, gets wider and wider. Well, this is the thing, is our knowledge of emptiness should do that over time. It's not like you get one teaching on emptiness and suddenly, it's all opened up to you. Some people have that experience, but it's probably because they've studied emptiness a lot in their prior lives and they're very, very close to a realization coming into this life. But most of us have to engage in lots of study, and as I was pointing out, lots of teachings from great masters who've realized emptiness, because they're going to have a very different way of explaining it, and it's very experiential and tasty. And you can kind of get a bit of that imparted to you as well. So shall we go back to the handout and continue this little exploration? I'm sure there were more quotes that I could have shared, but I think everyone got the point of this again, that when we say one taste, we're not meaning that there's a single phenomenon that is emptiness. And when we say the generality of emptiness versus its instances, you can't really find that thing then that is the generality, because the generality is referring to the common characteristic that brings all those things together. It's the instances that create the plurality of ultimate truth, which, as I said, are kind of lined up evenly with the conventional truths. So everything that exists conventionally has its respective emptiness. That emptiness is unique to that phenomenon. So in the Heart Sutra, it is a little confusing when we say form is emptiness, emptiness is form. It makes it sound like you're taking emptiness as this huge thing and making it equivalent to form. But in that context, it's meant to be form is its own emptiness, and its own emptiness is form. I mean, the two of them are this once more single entity that have been brought together, yet they are isolatable on the basis of two different ways of looking. Oh, here's the ultimate truth, because we're looking at whether it is ultimately established and finding that it isn't, that it lacks that, it's empty of that. And here's its conventional nature, which we come to discern is it's simply called that. It simply has its conventional nature on the basis of our designation of it as such. On an appropriate basis, obviously, because once more, we can't start designating things haphazardly, because then it loses all rhyme and reason. We don't have any way of even relying upon conventionality if people don't understand conventionality to some degree in the same way. So we're going to get into some of these delineations as we go through. I'm not going to use all of what Tsongkhapa talks about in terms of the two truths, but I want to use enough so that we get a deeper understanding of these two. Sure, Mark.
Okay. Can I look at a book or a glass or an object? And can I go perceive it in its ultimate emptiness, perceive it as the mere,
Imputation.
cast imputation on it, make it an object, go see the emptiness, go see the object.
You can alternate. You can alternate. Mark's question is, in regard to those two aspects, the conventional truth of a phenomenon, which in the end is its mere imputation, designation, and the ultimate truth, which is its emptiness of inherent existence. You can alternate between those two. In fact, when you even get to the point of being an Arya, a superior being who's had direct insight into emptiness, who's had that experiential taste of it, when they say emptiness and the mind realizing emptiness merge like water into water, even in that space, you do not realize the conventional nature of phenomena at all when you're realizing emptiness. And when you come out of that realization of emptiness, out of meditative equipoise, and are in subsequent attainment, it's called, then you can see that everything around you doesn't have that quality. So you see its emptiness in a sense through your having experienced it, but you then are knowing its conventional nature, knowing that there's no way for it to have anything more than nominal existence. So even for the bodhisattvas and the hearers and solitary realizers that are on that learning path, but are Aryas, they've had that direct realization, they still alternate between those two. It's only in the mind of a Buddha where those two come together. That's point number 6 on our little sheet here that we're going through. So yes, and it's helpful to do that, to kind of go back and forth in a sense, because it keeps you grounded in this understanding that's the middle way, that's not falling into either extreme again, because things too still do exist, albeit very slight, very, almost as if they don't exist, as Rinpoche says, and yet you want to hold the view of their emptiness. But while you are seeing the emptiness of something, you can't be seeing its conventional nature. And while you're seeing its conventional nature, you can't be seeing its emptiness, because they are mutually exclusive phenomena. Yeah. Yet inextricably bound up in the same single entity, so, and that single entity, don't reify that and think that you're trying to find something that is the single entity. The single entity is the combination of those two simply. It's the ultimate nature together with conventional nature. And we can talk about many conventional aspects of various things. He was pointing out, like the redness of a table versus or the shape of the table. You can find all these various things on a table, and table itself being merely established in that way. But emptiness is a unique phenomenon or quality in regard to that, because it is pointing to its ultimate truth. By the way, it is important to distinguish kind of ultimate nature and ultimate truth. Nothing has an ultimate nature, because if it did have it, we would find it when we investigate. What we find instead is emptiness, which is the ultimate truth. So ultimate gets used in 2 different ways in these different analyses, and it's important to distinguish those. So whenever we say, well, I'm looking for things ultimately, well, if you look for things ultimately, you don't find anything. You find a lack of that. Lack of an ultimate existence, you find instead emptiness, which is ultimate truth. So don't get the 2 confused in terms of, one is referring to what you are looking for when you are doing that ultimate analysis, and the other refers to the emptiness you find, which is the lack of that, which is ultimate truth. Maybe better to use different words for them. They sometimes do. They sometimes use absolute for one of them. Might look for what is, do an analysis to see if it's ultimately established, and instead you find absolute truth, that there is nothing from the side of the object that is established. But anyway, all right, let's jump back into the handout. So we're on point 3 then. And this is where we do get into some of this. We'll see this in Tsongkhapa's text to some degree. The term concealer truth. This is the derivation of the Samvriti, which is the Sanskrit, and then Gunsop Denpa, which is the Tibetan. That indicates that conventional phenomena are truths only for the perspective of an ignorant consciousness that conceals reality. That is an ignorant conception of phenomena as inherently existent. In fact, conventional phenomena are not truths, but are falsities, because they do not exist as they appear. I already explained this to some degree, but this is that idea that conventional truths, in the end, we find to be falsities, because the way they appear, as if they are self-established, as if book is established out here on its own, no relation to my designating it as book, no, relation even to its causes and conditions or its parts. It seems to have its own unity established out here on this that I'm holding in my hand. That way it appears, and how it actually exists, which I discern through the investigation to see if it has ultimate existence, if it has a mode of subsisting from its own side, those are contrary. Because when I go doing that investigation, I find that it doesn't have that at all. That this appearance of book on its own, from its own side out here, is false. It doesn't exist in that way. Conventional truths, as is said here, they're called concealer truths because they are established together with the ignorance that is obscuring reality, that is keeping us from knowing ultimate truth, keeping us from knowing emptiness. That ignorance is the ignorance that adheres to inherent existence, that grasps at things as if they did have that reality, that way of existing, that is how they appear. And I can't help but emphasize, that in my own investigation, this really gets to be the crux of it, is to really overcoming this idea that how things appear to us is correct. Things are appearing all the time to us. Even though when I use that analogy of a dream object, even your dream objects are appearing as if they are real from their own side. Everything we've known in our existence has appeared to us as if it existed from its own side, as if it had its own identity, self-established. And so we naturally buy into it, right? Because that's how it appears. We're under the control of that ignorance in the same way that in dream state, we're under the control of the mind of sleep. That isn't such a sharp mind if you're not, you bring some wisdom into this scenario, but it's the same in our daily life. Unless we bring that wisdom in, we're going to be under the control of this ignorance. So everything that is a conventional truth is established in the perspective of a mind that's together with ignorance. Therefore, it's concealed to its true nature. All these things seem to exist, they appear this way, and we adhere to them as if they existed that way. Then let me read number 4, and then we'll go to the little explanation that's on the back from Appearance and Reality by Guy Newland. He says, nonetheless, concealer truths are objects found by conventional valid cognition, while ultimate truths are objects found by ultimate valid cognition. Conventional valid cognition is not superseded or invalidated by ultimate valid cognition. This is when we talk about that bare level of what do we mean by conventional valid cognition. Maybe we'll get into that at some point later tonight, but this is the mode by which we establish what exists in our world around us. And of course, we're influenced by culture and language and the things that people say and all of this, the context for things. And so we identify certain things in a particular way. That is a form of valid cognition. Buddhists are big on valid cognition. It simply means knowing something correctly, being able to establish it in an incontrovertible way, an undeniable way. So we can establish that there's a chair in the room, that there are tables in the room, that there's, Amy in the room, and whatever, all the various things. We can use our conventional valid cognition to establish phenomena as existing as conventional truths. But in order to establish things in terms of ultimate truth, we have to do a different investigation. I mentioned this earlier, right? It's not just our conventional awareness of things. This is an actual ultimate analysis, an analysis, as it said, to look for the final mode of subsistence of things. That ultimate valid cognition finds emptiness. It finds ultimate truth. So when you find ultimate truth, it doesn't mean that then you've negated tables and chairs and all these things. You've only negated the mistaken idea of those phenomena, tables, chairs, and so on, as inherently existing. You've negated that overlay of things. So this is where conventional valid cognition is still together with that ignorance. That ignorance does need to be refuted because it's not in line with how things actually exist. But conventional valid cognition is still valid at its own level. We have to trust that. I think I've pointed this out before. I found it really interesting. It's in Elizabeth Napper's book, Dependent Arising and Emptiness. She quotes this one experience that Lama Tsongkhapa had. Lama Tsongkhapa had a vision of Manjushri who appeared to him, and he was struggling at the time, Lama Tsongkhapa, with discerning the meaning of emptiness. And Manjushri told him to value conventionalities. And I found that those two words are really quite important in our study. We have to value conventionalities. There is this tendency of it's a bit of a nihilistic bent, right? If we just put everything, all our money on emptiness, and we don't recognize that there's some merit and value to accepting that things are existing conventionally in the midst of this quality of emptiness that all these phenomena possess. Otherwise, we end up denying so much more. We had a little discussion before about a teaching that, I think I could share this, a teaching that someone heard online that was about morality not being perhaps as important as wisdom. But if you understand wisdom, then morality is really important. The two are the two sides of dependent arising and emptiness. Within emptiness, we have to totally embrace dependent arising, dependent origination. And within the understanding of dependent origination, we have to complement it with the teachings on emptiness, so that we're not clinging to all these things that are dependent arisings as if they existed in their own right, from their own side, whatever the case, whatever words we use to describe that. So these two are very important to uphold together. So this point is just telling us that ultimate valid cognition and conventional valid cognition are valid within their own domain. Ultimate valid cognition is looking only at the final mode of subsistence of things. Over here, conventional valid cognition is simply our worldly, mundane way of approaching our lives, of understanding things, which of course we have to enhance with our understanding that the Buddha gave us of karma and all the various topics that elaborate on, the view of our conventional existence. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, ultimate search and all of this is really a funny thing for us.
Yeah.
Because it's really running around asking other things exist.
Mm-hmm.
How does this chair exist? How does this cup exist? I mean, most of us never do that.
Yeah.
So it's a very odd thing for us to do. But that's basically, and when you talk about validating that, you're talking about really making sure you're right and you know how these things exist.
Mm-hmm.
But for most of this, we don't even know how to talk about it. And
Very
it's
true.
odd too, because the answer that the Buddha gives, he doesn't say anything positive about how it exists. He says, "Oh, it just doesn't exist in this way."
Right.
So
right.
actually, his view of talking about how things existing
Mm-hmm.
is just saying, well, however you think of existence, don't think of it this way.
Right. Right. So Bob was just pointing out that, again, this is, we're not used to that type of investigation, and most of us don't even think that way in terms of how do things actually exist. That's once more because we are buying into the false appearance and our apprehension of that, our belief in that we've had since beginningless time. And there's no need to question it until something comes along to say, hey, take a closer look, because things aren't existing in the way that they appear. And the second point that you were making is in terms of the, can't remember the last part, sorry.
That the answer is actually a negation.
Oh, that the answer is a negation. Yeah. Right.
He doesn't tell you
Yeah.
positive.
Yeah. Right.
He just tells you wherever you think about it, think about it.
Right. And then, the fact that it's a non-affirming negation, we use this for a reason. It's because, once more, we're not trying to affirm some other existence in the midst of that. We're trying to eliminate the false conceptions we have about how things exist. So that's why we call it a non-affirming negation. The examples that they use are always really strange to me, but if you have an affirming negation, well, then you're something that is going to be in the place of what you're saying isn't there. Like if I were to say, oh, there are no women in the Gompa tonight, well, what does it imply? That there are men in the Gompa tonight, right? There's an affirming thing by negating that there are women in the Gompa tonight. And the mere negation that would be non-affirming would be the extent of saying there is no elephant in the room. Well, that doesn't imply that there's anything else in the room, right? There's no basis that we call elephant, but does it imply that there's a giraffe in the room or that there's a zebra in the room? No, you don't get any affirmations out of that. It's a mere negation. And this is how the Buddha approached emptiness, is saying there is no inherently existent person. There is no inherently existent this, no inherently existent that. And so we don't ever get kind of anything to grab onto in the space of that. Nonetheless, the teachings on dependent arising do speak to how, in the end, everything is nominally existent, but nominal existence is just kind of what's left over in a sense. It's not affirmed in a formal way. It's just simply the acknowledgement that if we have refuted anything that is substantial, the only way that things can have any mode of existence is by virtue of them being merely imputed. Of course, they arise in dependence upon their causes and conditions, which are merely imputed. They arise in dependence upon their parts, which are merely imputed. In the end, that third level of dependent arising, understand that everything is merely imputed, merely designated, is the way that we come to still uphold or value conventionalities in the midst of negating any other mode of existence. So it's interesting stuff. Let me go through what Guy Newland says, because I put some points together, 3 and 4, in regard to what Guy Newland says in Appearance and Reality. This is on the second side of your handout. Gelugpa definitions of the two truths in the consequent system usually represent the two truths as objects of two different types of valid cognition. This is what I was just saying, right? Concealer truths are objects found through conventional valid cognition, while ultimate truths are objects found by ultimate valid cognition. Each valid cognizer operates within its own sphere of objects, certifying those objects as existent without damaging the existence of objects in the other sphere. So when we say there's a table in the room, we aren't negating the emptiness of table in any way by establishing it through valid conventional cognition. Nor when I say that table is empty of inherent existence and establish its ultimate truth, am I in any way negating its conventional nature. I'm just simply through an ultimate valid cognition finding the mode of subsistence of that table to not be inherently existent. I'm finding the lack of that. Okay, so each valid cognizer operates within its own sphere of objects, certifying those objects as existent without damaging the existence of objects in the other sphere. Among sentient beings, conventional valid cognizers are always mistaken consciousnesses because their objects deceptively appear to be inherently existent. Nevertheless, they are authoritative, incontrovertible knowers of their main objects. So while we would say that, yes, all these conventional cognitions that are going on, everything that people are doing in the world, the way that they're knowing the things around them and establishing them are together with ignorance and with that false appearance and an adherence to that false appearance. Nonetheless, they're correct in identifying things as chairs and tables and whatever. There is something we can rely upon in terms of the way people are. Again, and not to say that we accept everything that anybody says. That's not what this is saying, because we do have a measure of whether that is an appropriate label for that particular base. And of course, even within that, is there even a base for things? Because the Buddha would say that there are some things that people propound that there is no basis for, that we cannot find the basis in reality. So, in meditative equipoise on emptiness, this middle paragraph, all conventional phenomena utterly vanish. I was talking to Mark's question earlier. However, this does not mean that the existence of concealer truths is refuted by a yogi's ultimate realization. The ultimate valid cognizers of sentient beings are simply unable to realize ordinary phenomena at the same time that they directly realize emptiness. Only a Buddha can simultaneously maintain direct cognition of both ultimate truths and conventional truths. So it's only in the mind of a Buddha, once you've removed, remember how there are two levels of obscurations. The first level are the afflictive obscurations. That's the ignorance that is adhering to inherent existence, all of its seeds, as well as all the other delusions that arise on the basis of that. That's removed first. But for the Bodhisattva, they go on to remove the knowledge obscurations, the obscurations to omniscience, which are the imprints of that ignorance that give rise to the false appearance of inherent existence. That false appearance and those imprints are removed by the Bodhisattva on the three pure grounds, and eventually they remove them and attain Buddhahood. When they've removed them, they know both truths simultaneously. Yes, Tony. Uh-huh. Revealer truths, okay.
Anything that we experience, and I look at the chair, and it's concealed. But if I really get you,
Uh-huh.
to understand its nature, you no longer can conceal.
Uh-huh. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Right. So Tony's just saying, yeah, and in some sense you could maybe interpret it as a revealer truth if you understand, again, that, and while, yes, it is initially concealing its reality, it's also sort of revealing its reality. Well, in that sense, that, I mean, everything has always been empty of inherent existence. There is nothing that exists that has been missing that quality. We don't newly establish that quality by realizing it. It's always been there. In that way, I suppose we could say that it does have its own revelation. But it does obviously entail this other layer of investigation, as Bob was pointing out, that most beings don't even question. They just accept that everything that appears to them exists in the way that it appears. You know, this is why these teachings on emptiness are quite amazing, because, and it's not that everybody who hears them is instantly inclined to do that investigation either. But this is how things have always existed. They say that the emptiness of it would already be established there. It's not something that we're newly discovering at all. So in that way, we could say there is a form of a revealer to it, but I don't know if that's quite how you mean it, but it sounds like it is, yeah. Yeah.
I guess, well, you know, like, this is like, what I'm also expressing is non-duality.
Right.
All.
Of all reality, yeah.
The reality
Yeah.
of the convention and the reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then Tony was saying, yeah, that it's pointing out the non-duality of all reality. Well, and again, this is where things have never had this mode of subsistence that we are negating is purely a work of fiction. It's something we've laid over on things. So in that sense, there's never been that duality per se. Everything has always been of one taste and emptiness and so on, all these things that we use. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So quite inconceivable, yet we hang around conceiving it. Yeah, there's a question now from, thanks, Tony, a comment.
From Bill, he says, what is weird for me is that ultimate truth requires a valid cognizer, of which I am not one. It's like we just need to trust the Buddha, which is kind of tricky when it comes to grounded faith. Sorry, just thinking out loud. Further, are we not currently valid cognizers of conventional truths if we have yet to realize emptiness?
So first, just to the comment that Bill made, I mean, I think again, we do have to all be kind to ourselves in terms of this process and recognize that, yeah, we can develop ultimate valid cognition eventually, you know, and it does take that concerted effort to put our head to the teachings and make sure that we understand them, investigate them, and meditate on them, and we can eventually become that. But in regard to the second part, I mean, I'd say we all are conventional valid cognizers of the world around us. You know, we're going to get into in point number 5, the next point coming up, we're going to look at this idea that we can say that within things that could be established as conventional phenomena, some of them have another layer of mistake, such as mirages that appear like they're water, and you know, or the yellow that appears to a person with jaundice, so that everything that they see looks like it's yellow. Those false appearances are more refutable in that regard, whereas the false appearance that conventionalities appear to everyone with is something you have to actually go to a deeper level to refute. So I'd say all of us, as long as we have functioning valid senses and are able to understand things and what have you, are valid cognizers of the world around us. We're establishing things through the force of convention, through what we have learned, through our own investigation of the world. And in that way, so when we talk about this idea of understanding, back to Mark's thing from the Diamond Sutra, when we come back around after we realize ultimate truth to understand this subtle way that conventionalities exist, it's the idea is that that does take some investigation into emptiness, some understanding of emptiness, to come back around to see, aha, things are really just imputed, merely designated. We can say that now, but I don't think we have the full impact of it until you have that direct realization. I don't think you get this kind of like aha moment of coming out of your meditation when you directly realize emptiness and you go, wow, it's so clear to me now. It's so clear that none of this exists in the way that it appears at all. Just like if you were really able to lucidly dream, if you were in your dreams and all these things are appearing, and you're just able to be there in that perfect wisdom that knows that everything that is appearing is a dream object. It has no more reality than as a dream that's conjured up by your mind in sleep. You would know that those things are existing in a totally different way than how they appear. So that level of it, yes, I think, you can say we're maybe not valid cognizers of that aspect of conventional nature, but in terms of conventional truths, we're all valid cognizers of that because we're all establishing the world around us in correct ways. If we had incorrect senses or misunderstandings of things or whatever, then we would be, not correct in regard to certain things, but all of us have some correctness, I think. I was thinking about, I don't know why I was thinking about Helen Keller earlier today, that movie, The Miracle Worker. You kind of go through this process of just watching her in this space of a different level of ignorance and her kind of awakening to, conventionalities at a very different way, in a very different mode than what most of us experience the conventional world. But I would say she's still a valid cognizer of the things that she was able to know in spite of not having any vision or any hearing and what have you. So, I think we're all valid cognizers in that context. Conventional. Yeah, Stephen.
And an ultimate valid cognizer, is that a conceptual consciousness?
So ultimate valid cognizer, Stephen asks, is a conceptual consciousness. If we talk about, I think we have to say that there is an inferential level to this that is conceptual still. Because when we talk about the 5 paths and we talk about when you move from the path of accumulation to the path of preparation, it's with a conceptual understanding of emptiness. It's a union of calm abiding and special insight that is knowing emptiness in a conceptual way. Now, I think we have to say you are still knowing emptiness, although albeit not in its direct, non-conceptual way, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense to say that, there's got to be a qualification for doing that. They often say that those who aren't realizing emptiness correctly are sort of stuck on the path of accumulation, never entering the path of preparation because they never have the correct conceptual understanding of emptiness. So there is what we call the correct conceptual understanding of it. It's an inferential valid cognition of emptiness that occurs definitely when one enters into the path of preparation, if not before. Then one fine-tunes that through deepening the investigation where subject and object, this delineation, become less and less. The dualistic kind of thing begins to fall away more and more. And when it completely falls away and one enters into the direct realization on the path of seeing is when it becomes a direct valid cognition, what we call a yogic direct valid cognition. But prior to that, we would say, yes, you would have an inferential cognition of it. Now, are we having inferential cognitions of it right now in our investigation of emptiness based on whatever each of us have done in the room? Very hard to say. I don't, that would have to, that's more personal investigation perhaps.
And then after you leave meditative equipoise and re-enter subsequent attainment, then you return to the world of conventionalities, I guess.
Yeah.
And then you would have, I guess, a deeper understanding
Mm-hmm.
therefore being valid, conceptual, ultimate cognizer.
So when you said out of meditative equipoise, you're talking about the yogi who's realized emptiness directly then, yeah. So that last part, I'm not sure. You would have, as the yogi exits from...
Differentially, you could achieve
Mm-hmm.
valid ultimate cognition.
Mm-hmm.
Then, and that's prior to having a direct realization.
Right.
Because then afterwards, therefore, you would also, having left meditative equipoise,
Mm-hmm.
you would return to that state of valid,
But conceptual.
not conceptual.
I mean, I haven't really thought about it, but so Stephen was saying, yeah, when we talk about that yogi who's exiting the meditative equipoise, having had the direct realization of emptiness or that direct ultimate valid cognition, would they return to a conceptual ultimate valid cognition in subsequent attainment when they're relating to the world? But everything becomes conceptual at that point. And you no longer have the yogic direct perception present because you're not in meditative equipoise. But you have obviously a very different flavor to all of it because you're influenced by that realization. It's not it's going to be bound up with you. Again, you'll never be without it in a sense. So it's going to influence your awareness of that. Where it falls between those two, I mean, I guess it is conceptual, because the conceptual mind would be there, but because you've had the direct valid cognition, I would think it would be of a different flavor, but I don't know.
Example of a magician knows,
Yeah,
can see the effects
yeah,
of the spell, but knows that it's something that he's responsible for, the task that it's time.
right. Yeah, and I think that that would be still, again, in a conceptual way, that there's an understanding. So,
Could you
yeah.
briefly define meditative equipoise?
Yes, sure. Mark asked for a definition of meditative equipoise. I don't know if I can give a definition, I give a description. It is a meditative session wherein there are two parts to it. One goes into a realization of emptiness that is, again, non-conceptual, that is direct, and engages in what's called an uninterrupted path. Uninterrupted path means that there is a level of concentration supporting this, that you stay in that mode as an antidote to a level of the obscurations. And so they say, it was in that one book, Path to the Middle, I didn't bring that with me tonight, but Kensur Yeshe Topten is interviewed in there, and he says that the person, the bodhisattva who is in that meditative equipoise, an atom bomb could go off and they wouldn't be disturbed out of that. So there is a unity of mind, of singular purpose of mind that is going into that is in the uninterrupted path. It is realizing emptiness, and that is acting as an offset to a level of the obscurations. Then there is, following after that, what's called the liberated path. The liberated path, or the path of release, is where that level of obscuration that wisdom was antidoting has now been removed. They compare this to taking the thief and putting it outside and then closing the door. So
what you're saying implies, I think, that previous to that, there's a meditation where you experience direct emptiness directly, but then immediately go.
So your first, if it's your path of seeing, that where you're getting your initial direct realization of emptiness, you will have gone into meditation with all the analysis that you've been doing in terms of emptiness. And you will have that conceptual mind that is realizing it. When you get to the arrival of it, because of the strength of your meditation and all that you've done on the path of preparation preceding it, you will go into a meditative equipoise where it becomes non-conceptual. Through the force of course, you have to have a deep level of concentration to begin with. Calm abiding, or one of the concentrations, that'd be a support for that. Then when you have that, you go into that path of seeing out of a conceptual mind into a direct realization. So you will not have had a direct realization of emptiness prior to that if this is your first one on the path of seeing, which the path of seeing is the initial direct realization of emptiness, whether you do it on a Hinayana path or a Mahayana path. So when you are in that space realizing emptiness, there are two aspects to it. The first is that uninterrupted path. The second is the liberated path, where there is a true cessation of that level of obscuration. And then you exit from the meditative equipoise into subsequent attainment, which is when you come out of meditation and you're functioning in the world. And of course, you have these insights that we're just talking about here. So meditative equipoise is a unique experience from what they say, which again, I can't speak to, but maybe I'll go back to the definition if I can find it, that I know, I'm pretty sure where it is. It's in the materials we had for ornament. Some of you studied chapter 4 of ornament, and there was a study guide, and I think it had a description of what we mean by meditative equipoise, but it's not a normal, thing that we have, like, oh, I had my meditative equipoise this morning. It's something that you work your way up to and eventually experience. And that, again, will act as that antidote to some level of the obscurations. And I'm not sure if all of them have to be an antidote, because I think you can probably have further meditative equipoises in subsequent, in that period afterwards. But you never have them before, because again, no, it's not to say that you haven't realized something directly before, because oftentimes a direct realization of impermanence, the subtle impermanence of all conditioned phenomena, that happens before emptiness. So, yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, once you've had the initial breakthrough,
Yeah.
where you achieve the path to seeing, then you can meditate again and again.
Yeah.
And each time you meditate, you go into the special equipoise,
Yeah.
where you directly experience
Yeah.
emptiness directly. But then whenever you come out, then you're just like an ordinary person again, and you see the world just the way
Yeah.
you normally do.
Informed by all that wisdom, but yeah.
But once
Yeah.
you've had such a
Yeah.
dramatic
Yeah.
experience, you can never forget it.
Yeah.
It transforms
Right.
how you look at everything.
Yeah. So Bob's just saying, yeah, again, that we will have subsequent meditative equipoise from that initial one, but every time you come out of that, you're dealing with conventional reality. You're dealing with the world around you.
Well,
And
wasn't that an experience where you struggle and meditate and visualize, and then bam, you have an experience of emptiness, which is very woo-woo, frightening, threatening to the self. And so then you run from there. So then you go back and do it again, and then you go back and do it again. And each, you're able to do it more.
So again, what Mark is speaking to is when on your engagement in meditation on emptiness, you're having these experiences that start to touch on the object of negation, what we are trying to negate, especially if we're negating the strong sense of I that's there that seems so real, that invokes some fear or invokes some kind of other, thing. But you have to keep going back to kind of push through that and get to that.
A little further, a little
Yeah.
farther, a little longer.
Yeah, I think those are all part of the process. They're not anything we should get too attached to. They're just part of what most people will go through in terms of breaking down that strong sense of self. But as I mentioned, I mean, even to get to this path of preparation, well, first of all, even for a bodhisattva to be on the path of accumulation, you have to have uncontrived bodhicitta. So that's a whole nother kind of aspect that's not related to wisdom. It's the method side of it. But to get to the path of preparation, the second one, you do have to have a union of calm abiding and special insight, meaning calm abiding is that level of meditation that is developed through the 9 mental abidings, and you attain this special suppleness, pliancy of body and mind at that level. It's a unique experience in and of itself, and it's just a meditative state. But then on the basis of that meditative state, having done the investigation into emptiness that goes through all of these kind of barriers to realizing it and gets to a place where you can unite that special insight with a very stable mind of calm abiding, and you realize emptiness conceptually, that gets you into the path of preparation. So there's a lot of work to do to get to that even, and then you continue to, on the path of preparation, fine tune that so that you can attain the path of seeing. So trust that it's all part and parcel of the whole process to get there, but not to have, I guess why I'm bringing up all of that is so that we don't have this mistaken idea that we've realized emptiness. Because I think if you've had that experience, you know it, I think. I don't think it can be mistaken. I mean, I'm not, again, speaking from personal experience. I just think that there's going to be some real shift in terms of one's own understanding when you come out of that meditation.
The reason I don't like your model is because I think the little pieces that are, you're going, oh, this is, you got a long way to go. You got a long way. I think those little pieces are like gold.
Oh, sure they are.
They're like signposts. They're really valuable.
Yeah.
They're like going, okay, so now we're going to go get another little piece, and another little piece, and another little piece.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not trying to diminish their importance at all. I'm just wanting to make sure that people don't have a misunderstanding that those initial experiences are kind of the real gold. I mean, they're gold, as you're pointing out, Mark, in that they are useful and they are pointing us in the right direction. They often say that if we are investigating, especially the I, and we do have some fear arising, then we are probably touching on the object of negation, and we should continue that, keep going to that place, because that is, of course, making sure again that we don't fall into a nihilistic bent, that we somehow negate the self entirely, but rather trying to fine tune that and work with that, because that's a good indicator that we're heading in the right direction. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I think that the other point though too is that before you have this direct realization of emptiness, you've got to have these amazing feats of meditation that are transformative all in and of themselves.
Yeah.
Like shamatha, abiding, all these
Right.
things, where your meditation is qualitative change.
Right.
And it takes a huge amount of work to achieve these very deep meditations.
Yeah. But, we all can do it. And Bob was just saying, yeah, we have to keep in mind that these meditations, as I was pointing out, the calm abiding, that very initial level of meditative stabilization, that is a basis for these types of realizations. That has to be cultivated. And, we do have Buddha, all the teachers I've had say that we've done these things many, many times. We've developed calm abiding and all these concentrations throughout our beginningless lives. We've done these many times, but we just didn't use them for anything other than the peace of that meditation. They say it's very peaceful to be in these states. That's why it's even called shine in Tibetan, which means peace abiding or calm. The peace that you have when you're in that meditation is quite profound, but it's not an end in and of itself. So if you develop that and you think it is, and you just sort of hang out there your whole life in this meditative state, well, it's not going to do you much good because it's a support for the realization of emptiness and so on. Yeah, Tony, were you going to?
May I ask Mark a question?
Yeah, I think so, but we're about 8:15. So what was your question? Go ahead, Tony.
Mark, and if I understand correctly, you're meditating and experience an aspect of emptiness, or you can feel emptiness, and you became frightened.
Oh, yeah. I will say, which I, take right out of the Lama Yishi's book. If you meditate on consciousness and you do it with extreme effort, bam, you will smack right up into emptiness.
All right.
That's what I
Kind of a Mahamudra technique, yeah.
I just want to.
Yeah.
And it will not be, it will not be a pleasant experience because emptiness means everything is empty. All your friends are empty, your family's empty, your history's empty, your dreams are empty, this is empty.
So those online, we're just having a cross talk between Tony and Mark in terms of his experience in that. And again, so I think it's encouraging. I don't want to in any way discourage those types of investigations because I think they're really an important part of the process. I just wanted to make sure there's no confusion about where that lies in terms of this schema. In order to not have to revisit this, what we were just talking about, I'm just going to read the last paragraph that's on the handout because we've already talked about it, and it's just to make sure that there's no confusion on this, and then we'll conclude for tonight. So thus, the two valid cognizers are two different pathways for getting at what exists, like two different wavelengths on a receiver, or listening versus watching, or glancing versus staring. One of them, ultimate valid cognition, gets at the way things really are, the final mode of abiding of things, but cannot see persons, actions, and their effects, and other phenomena that do not exist just as they appear. The other conventional valid cognition can see the class of conventional phenomena, existence that falsely appear to be inherently existent, but that valid cognizer is unable to get at emptiness. If you want to read a nice little thing on that in an Introduction to Emptiness by Guy Newland as well, there's a little section beginning on page 41, and it's about he compares them to two stations on a radio. So you have channel A, that's all conventional phenomena all the time, and channel B, that's all emptiness all the time. And of course, you can only listen to one or the other, and that's in our current state without, we have to pay attention to one or pay attention to the other. But a Buddha, of course, can hear both of those at the same time. But it's just, again, another way to look at this, that these are two different ways of getting at what exists. And so that's why, back to Bill's question, we all have valid cognition conventionally because we are able to establish what exists in the conventional world. Now, we might not be perfect in all of that, but we are sufficient to be able to establish that. And of course, we do have some things that we think exist that don't exist, which is namely inherent existence, which we all kind of conventionally agree to, but nonetheless doesn't exist. But that's refuted by ultimate truth. And that's a fiction that has always been there, that we have always held to, but it can be refuted by getting at how things exist in that final mode of subsistence, how they actually exist through the investigation of their ultimate nature. So, Okay, lots of words tonight. So when we reconvene in 2 weeks, we will continue on and maybe very briefly go through 5 and 6 on here, but I would encourage you just to read these through, and they make a lot of sense. There's no real comments on 6 because this is what we've already talked about in terms of Buddhas, and we've already touched on point 5, so maybe we'll just leave this behind and go forward into what Tsongkhapa says. Let's go to the prayer book then to do our dedications. Page 235. We'll do the first 2 prayers there. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then go to 244. It's where there's a paper clip in our books here in the Gompa. On page 245 is the clipped on prayer for His Holiness. We'll recite that first, and then the prayer for Lama Zopa on page 244. And as we recite these 2 prayers, think that we're creating the causes for all spiritual guides, whatever their tradition might be, to have good health and long lives so that we and others will continue to have perfect guides in all our lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplished magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And lastly, just dedicate for anyone that you're holding in your heart right now. We all have individuals that we know who are experiencing some difficulties, obstacles, who have illness. We may even know those who have died or who are dying at this time. We also might have places in the world where there's great strife or suffering that we are thinking of at this period. So whoever it is that we're thinking of, think that this positive energy we've created tonight becomes the cause to relieve all of their suffering and to bring all of them to perfect happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through our efforts here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. Enjoy Venerable Angie. I'm sorry I'll miss her. And I'll see you all in 2 weeks.